Hello, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us today. We have a fabulous panel lined up. Gun violence and communities of color. I'm Caroline Fredrickson. I'm the president of the American Constitution Society. And I think most of you know ACS, but in case you don't, we are coming into our 15th year. And we are a national network of progressive lawyers, judges, policymakers, academics, and students who believe that the law should be a force to improve the lives of all people. And ACS works for positive change by shaping the debate on vitally important legal and constitutional questions. Our mission is to ensure that the fundamental principles of human dignity and individual rights and liberties enjoy their rightful, central place in American law. It is through our network that we disseminate the ideas and the solutions that advance these progressive ideals. So I think, unfortunately, we are all too familiar with the devastating toll that gun violence takes on our nation. But today, the gun violence prevention community is making great strides in reshaping the debate after more than a generation in which the NRA's radical pro-gun position has all but silenced moderate voices. But while headlines and cable news coverage focus on tragic and all too frequent mass shootings to which we've become almost inured, there is a more deadly epidemic of gun violence that we rarely hear about, that plagues communities of color, particularly in urban areas. In a recent report in ProPublica, How the Gun Control Debate Ignores Black Lives, our moderator for today's conversation, Lois Beckett, noted that in 2012, 90 people were killed in mass shootings. In that same year, nearly 6,000 Black men were murdered with guns. And the fact is, Black and Hispanic Americans are far more likely to be victims of a homicide involving a gun than their white counterparts. Lois, who is now a senior reporter with The Guardian, covering gun policy and politics, is going to lead our panel of esteemed academics and advocates in examining how gun violence affects communities of color, how members of these communities are responding and creating space for themselves within the gun violence prevention movement, and the steps that cities, states, and the federal government can take to address this violence in light of the Supreme Court's and lower federal courts' current understanding of the Second Amendment. So please join me in welcoming this wonderful panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much for all of you for being here today. I just want to introduce our panelists. We have Darrell Miller, who's with the Duke University School of Law, Second Amendment scholar, and who has written, among other papers, Guns as Smut, Defining a Home-Based Second Amendment, which we'll talk about a little bit. Great title. We have Chelsea Parsons, who's with the Center for American Progress, does guns and crime policy, and Amber Goodwin, who's an advocacy director with Americans for Responsible Solutions, the gun violence prevention group headed by Gabby Giffords. So we're a small group today. I want to get right into the meat of our discussion. Very briefly, of gun homicide victims in America, more than half of them are Black men. And by any measure of looking at the safety of Americans when it comes to guns, communities of color are more impacted, whether you're measuring rates of PTSD, non-fatal shootings, or gun homicides. Always important in these conversations to remember that we're going to be talking about statistics, we're going to be talking about the law, and we're going to be talking about policy solutions. This is a room full of lawyers and policy people. That's what we do. But we're in a city, D.C., that saw, I think, 162 homicides last year. One mother of one victim, LaShawn Holtzclaw, told the Washington Post, my son is not a statistic. His name is Malik. His name is Malik Thomas, 21 years old, shot to death, burned in his car. And she told the Post, it is not the wish of my family to have Malik known simply as D.C.'s 108th homicide. So keeping our attention on policy and laws, we do all of the work here today always comes back to families, to young men, to their family members, to their children, to their parents. Always keep that in mind. So we're going to start with Amber and Chelsea, and I would love for both of you to talk a little bit about starting, I think maybe Chelsea, around Sandy Hook. Let's talk about the gun violence prevention movement traditionally in the United States. What has that looked like? What has it focused on? And how well has that lined up with the actual impact of gun violence on Americans?
Sure, thanks. I'm happy to do that. Good afternoon. So I think thinking about the gun violence prevention movement over time, and I'm looking at a bunch of folks who've been in this movement for a very long time, I think that the shooting in Newtown did represent a turning point and kind of the beginning of a new phase of gun violence prevention advocacy and policy work in this country. I think looking back, prior to that, there have been efforts to address gun violence in this country for many decades. There have been organizations and individuals working on these issues for a long time, and really recognizing a couple of things that remain true, which is that the United States suffers from levels of gun violence and gun homicide that are unparalleled among our peer nations. I believe the gun murder rate in the United States is more than 20 times higher than our peer nations. And gun deaths in this country have not been going down, right? These numbers have remained largely stagnant since the decline in overall violent crime rates, from in the early 90s. And I think part of the reason why we think that this is true, that we haven't seen more progress made on reducing gun deaths in this country, is because there hasn't been the same kind of commitment and devotion of resources to the issue of gun violence in this country as there has been on other causes of death. So the comparison that we often use is kind of comparing car accident fatalities with gun violence fatalities. And when you look at those two lines, what you see is car accident deaths have gone way down while gun related homicides have stayed largely the same. In terms of the gun violence prevention movement, I think that historically, the organizations and the individuals working at the national level on gun violence prevention policy issues have been predominantly white. I think that the makeup of the movement, at least on the national level, and I think that there is, I think it's worth saying, and I think we'll probably say this a couple times, is that there are some really key differences between what the national organizations look like working on this issue and what a lot of the state and local organizations working on this issue look like. And the way that the gun violence prevention movement has approached the issue has been largely focused on laws and policies aimed at reducing access to firearms by individuals who are deemed to pose an increased risk to public safety. And so when I think about the challenge of gun violence in this country and kind of solutions to the problem, or at least solutions that are offered to the problem, I think about it in two pieces. You have the issue of access to firearms and the gaps in our laws in this country that allow for a almost entirely unregulated secondary market of illegally trafficked firearms. And then there's the issue of root causes of violence and kind of what drives all types of violence in high-impact communities. And I think that the gun violence prevention efforts, at least at the national level writ large, have been very focused on the first piece of it, which is laws and policies aimed at access to guns. And I think that that makes a lot of sense because while we know that access to firearms does not by itself cause violence, access to firearms is what makes interpersonal violence much more likely to be fatal. And so when you have communities that are flooded with firearms that come from these unregulated illegal secondary markets in guns, the easy access to guns, which we know in some communities are passed around through social networks. We hear this all the time. I think somebody said it when we were in Milwaukee. It's easier to get a gun than it is to get their hands on a computer, right? And so when you have this kind of access to firearms, it drives the number of fatalities that result from interpersonal violence in the communities. And so, in many respects, I think it makes a lot of sense that the national organizations focused on gun violence prevention have focused a lot on these kinds of laws and policies that would have an impact on reducing this illegal secondary market in firearms. On the other hand, I think that there is a lot of room to look at the second piece of it, which is underlying root causes of violence, and to look at policies and programs that are designed to intervene and have an impact at the most local level to reduce some of these gun deaths. And so I think that's an area where many of the national gun violence prevention organizations, and CAP is one, and there are others, have been trying to expand what our kind of core policy priorities are to include the kinds of policies and programs that actually speak to the kind of day-to-day lived experience of gun violence in a lot of impacted communities. And so that involves increased support and resources for interrupter programs, ceasefire programs. It involves kind of thinking about gun violence in the larger context of other issues that are of kind of urgent importance in these communities. So thinking about gun violence in the context of a community that also has really serious issues in terms of policing and police-community relationship and police violence. Thinking about gun violence in the context of a community that also has really high levels of concentrated poverty and lack of access to jobs and education, and kind of how do those issues connect to gun violence, and how can the kind of national organizations that have the platform that we have be responsive to those kinds of issues in a way that helps elevate and support the programming and the work that's already going on in the community. And so that's kind of some of the things that we've been thinking about. I think the other thing that I'll say too is thinking about as we work on developing kind of national level legislative ideas and policy proposals, making sure that we think through the potentially the unintended consequence of some of these laws on the very communities that we know are most impacted by gun violence. So making sure that we think through how does this new law potentially play out in the community when we know that there are really serious challenges in terms of how police are charging crimes, how prosecutors are handling cases, and kind of making sure that we're not unintentionally adding to a problem of over-incarceration and over-policing of communities that already are experiencing really high levels of gun violence.
So not creating new laws to criminalize the behavior of young men of color in the attempt to save their lives.
Exactly, and just thinking through, thinking through the impact of some of these laws. And so while we may think that we need to make sure that guns aren't easily accessible by this particular population with a certain criminal history, because we know that these folks perhaps pose an increased risk, thinking through, but what does adding that new law look like when you think through all of the phases of its enforcement?
Right. So much there to dig into. No, that's great. So let's return actually to that question of unintended consequences. And Amber, I would love for you to jump in here and talk a little bit about, your perspective on the things that Chelsea's raised, but particularly, this is something that has played out over the last 3 years in rooms in DC in a very practical way, in a very uncomfortable way, with personal relationships of people trying to change policy by changing who's in the room. And I would love to hear your perspective on that.
Thank you very much. And just by way of introduction, I work for Americans for Responsible Solutions, which is an organization that was started by Congresswoman Gabby Giffords and her husband, Captain Mark Kelly, about 3 years ago, sort of in response to the Sandy Hook shooting that happened in 2012, but also just in response to what I think all of us in this room know, the traumatic incident that happened in Tucson 5 years ago. And just by show of hands, I want to kind of give some context here, so only raise your hand if you feel comfortable. But has anybody in this room ever been shot? Anyone? Okay. Has anyone ever been threatened with a firearm? Anyone? Anyone here ever been incarcerated? Any organizations here that have leaders that are African American or Latino or people of color? Right. Anyone in here ever been discriminated against because of your race? I ask all these questions just not for fun, to see who's in the room, but to give some context, because I think it's really important that we think about not only these policies, who's at the table, but really what's actually happening. There's a lot of really great reports and statistics on what the cost of gun violence is, and I'm going to talk about a really great one that just came out last week on healing communities in crisis from the Law Center that talks about the cost. The cost of $290 billion a year is the cost of gun violence in this country, but there's also a human cost, right? Every time that a firearm is shot in this country, there's a cost to that, and it doesn't matter whether or not that person was shot and killed, but there's a human cost. And so I think that a lot of what I'll talk about is really about how we're framing and centering ourselves, because I am an organizer. I think I'm the only non-lawyer here. And so thinking about this really from how we are centering the conversation and always centering the conversation from a social justice perspective and making sure that we're coming from a place of humanity for the people who are either victims or perpetrators of these crimes that we're talking about, and that we're actually thinking about it from a human perspective. And just to kind of take us back a little bit, I think that there's been a lot of talk about, Black Lives Matters and different groups who are working on criminal justice reforms right now. And to go back to how that even started, the first kind of time that people were talking about Black Lives Matters was a love letter that was written to the Black community in 2012, which was something that, for me, I was like, I can't believe that someone had to write a love letter to the Black community, and this has gone viral, but it went viral for a reason. And if you look back at writings from Marcus Garvey, from Dr. Martin Luther King, it always comes from our place of love, especially for Black Americans in this country, because of the systemic racism, the systemic non-inclusion that has happened with our communities. And so I think that it's been a huge problem across this country, not just with the gun violence prevention community. I think that if we were sitting in this room and talking about the environment, or if we were talking about women's health, it would probably look the same. We'd probably still be talking about the same challenges, both on a national and state level. A couple of statistics that I wanted to share with you guys, and some of them are from people who are sitting in this room who've done a lot of really great work on gun violence prevention, but just talking about really the problem. We see African American men mostly talked about in terms of uses of firearms, and African American women are also victims of, or survivors and also victims of gun violence in this country. Every 21 hours, an African American woman is killed, mostly by firearms in this country. We hear about the men, the perpetrators, how many, I think 6% African American men are 6% of the population, but 50% of the incarcerated individuals in this country. But African American women are also dying in this country. The rate of suicides, especially for white Americans, white men, is around 70%. But the rate of homicides by firearm, it's almost exactly flipped whenever you're talking about white men and African American men. I'll talk about some of the there's been some really great research and some really great programmings that have happened, but also wanted to just also say that, I do think that, and this is one of the terms, Chelsea and I did this, and I'll talk about this too, a program over the last year where we went to different cities through the Joyce Foundation, the Urban Institute, and talked to people on the ground in an engaging communities discussion about what does gun violence community look like across the country. But one of the things that we did hear was people talking about what they called a political loophole. And when I heard that, I was like, I know what a gun show loophole is, but I don't know what a political loophole is. But we talked to formerly incarcerated individuals in Richmond, California, and a lot of people there said, I hear from politicians, and I hear from all of you guys from your nice, fancy, I am not fancy, but your nice, fancy offices in DC all the time. You come in and you ask us about what's happening in our communities, and you feel great about it, and then you leave. And so I think one of the challenges that we see is that happens. If I was telling Chelsea earlier today that if I get one more call about someone wanting to do data and research about African Americans and gun violence, I'm probably going to lose it because I think we have been studied. I think we have the data, we have the research, and it's important to know that we have that and continue to do the research and the data so that we have that to inform our work. But we also need to make sure that we're actually building infrastructure and building communities where we say that we want to and where the data shows that we need to be building these different communities. So just to kind of also, and I think this is something that Chelsea and I both wanted to talk about, was to kind of take us back to 2012, which was a pretty big year in a lot of ways. It was an election year, but what also happened in that year was the Sandy Hook shooting at the end of the year. But two other incidents that happened were the Trayvon Martin shooting happened that year, and Jordan Davis was also murdered that year in Florida. And so for the gun violence prevention community, I think that there was definitely a lot of groups, including mine, ARS, and Everytown for Gun Safety, who's done a lot of really great work in this field as well. It was something that people were aware of, but didn't really take to heart as like, what can we actually do? There was a national outcry about firearms, African Americans, use of force, hate crimes, but there wasn't really anything that people felt like they could do. So that happened in 2012. In 2014, we saw, Tamir Rice was also murdered in Cleveland. And so again, a national conversation around use of force happened, but there wasn't really a coming together of the gun violence prevention community around what are we going to do about this? Can we hold elected officials accountable? Can we hold lawmakers and law enforcement accountable for what's happening in our communities? And we saw all of the different uprisings in Ferguson after the Michael Brown shooting happened. And so I think that there's been a lot of things that have happened over the last 3 years since a lot of the organizations that kind of sit at what we call, quote unquote, the gun table here in DC. And I'd say that there is roughly 30 to 40 groups that sit around that national table. And then there are state-based groups that are kind of affiliated with those organizations. But I would say that probably the biggest marker in terms of really having a conversation around race and inclusion happened last year when the Charleston shooting happened. We all came together and had a conference call the day after the Charleston shooting happened at the end of last summer and said, we need to do something, we need to talk about this. And some of the things that people who I think the world of, but didn't think the world of after this call said were, this reminds me of Tucson, or like this reminds me of Sandy Hook, or this reminds me of this other shooting. And all of us know that that wasn't the case. We know that this crime was racially motivated. We know that this should have been considered a hate crime, and we know that this was something that happened that we needed to talk about as a community. And so we had the conference call. A lot of other people felt the same way that I did. So I know Mayu and Nick, who are here from Gen Progress, and Chelsea and a lot of us came together and decided that we needed to have a larger conversation. And so we had a large meeting of the Gun Violence Prevention Advocates conference call last August, I think it was August 2nd of last year, and really talked about how we were going to hold ourselves accountable. And in that conversation, we also talked explicitly about race. And so I think that that's something that's very important to point out, is that I think we skirt around it all the time. It makes everyone uncomfortable, probably besides me, to talk about race. I think that it's something that is healthy. I think it's very dangerous what we're seeing in this country, and I think it's because we don't talk about race enough. And I think we need to talk about it in a productive way, but also in an understanding way of what's actually happening and the effect of not talking about race in this country. And so after that happened, we formed a working group to talk about race and guns. And again, being an organizer, I was like, I do not want to be part of a working group because they are not going to work. But I can say that this working group actually does work. I help facilitate the discussion, but it is with people from tons of other organizations across the country, both national and state, who are trying to do better whenever it comes to race and inclusion. So we put together an assessment, and one of the reasons why we put together an assessment of what the gun violence prevention community looks like is I helped institute or was a part of an organization called Power Pack, and they put out in 2014 a report, the Fannie Lou Hamer report, which was about inclusion mostly in the Democratic Party on how resources were expended to contractors and into people of color, firms of color with the Democratic Party. And so they have kind of a layout of what it looked like to really do an assessment on diversity and inclusion. And so one of the first things that they talk about is doing an assessment of where we are. I thought at first that was like not the smartest use of our time, but because I think that we could all have said, yes, we have a challenge with race and making sure that we're inclusive of people of color in the gun violence prevention community, but it needed to actually be a little bit more scientific than somebody just saying that, and we also needed to all be on the same page about where we're at. And so we did that, and I have a couple of the statistics, but we asked the question about does any of the groups that sit around the gun table have a person of color that is their president or executive director, and the answer was no. When we asked whether or not any of the groups around the table actively recruit interns or kind of have a leadership development program for people of color to be a part of their organization, and 81% said yes, which is really great. And again, Done Progress has done a really great job of making sure that there's a pipeline for young people of color to be involved in the gun violence prevention movement. When we asked whether or not their organization actually tracks policies about impacted communities or communities of color, 30% said yes. A lot of them said they just do what CAP says, and so they were like just saying that they listen to what the CAP does, which a lot of us do. But then the flip side of that is when we asked, do you have communication strategies around addressing when there are issues with race and gun violence prevention, and 80% said no. So people are tracking this information, they may have this information, or they're thinking about this information, or they know it's a problem, but they're not actually doing anything externally to kind of fix and challenge that problem. The other thing that they did that we asked about was on programming, and 85% of the respondents said that they did not actually have programming around race, guns, or with impacted communities. And when I say impacted communities, I mean urban communities of color. So that is a challenge, right? And so part of what we are tasking ourselves to do is to make sure that we are holding ourselves accountable, and we think about it in two ways, both internally and externally. Internally, we have to have more people of color as a part of this movement. Like, bottom line, there is no question about it. No one can argue with us whenever we say that, but what are we actually going to do to make sure that that happens? We need to hire more people of color. We need to make sure that we're doing a concerted effort to work with organizations that do that. And then we also need to make sure that we're holding ourselves accountable when we're talking to these policymakers. There are 540 members of Congress, roughly 9% of them are African American and 7% are Latino. The same pretty much breakdown is in the state legislators. There's about 7,300 state legislators across the country, and about 8.9% of them are people of color. And so there's a challenge both on the state and national level. And I'm not going to sit up here and say that, like, if we just brought the CBC or the National Caucus of Black Legislators to every meeting, it's going to solve the problem. Just having a black person or a person of color in the room doesn't just solve the problem. They need to be intentionally bought into and also a part of the leadership process for organizations. So I know I just rambled a little bit. I definitely at some point want to kind of bring up, there have been some really great studies and report that Chelsea and I have both either been a part of or can talk a little bit more about in terms of solutions as well.
Before we move on to solutions, let's talk a little bit more about all of these dynamics you're discussing. Obviously, what we're talking about here is a gun violence prevention movement in which you said that 85% of the groups responding to the survey said they didn't have any material or programming specifically about race and guns in America, even though young black men are the majority of gun violence victims in America. Yeah. So can we talk a little bit more? What are some of the, we've talked a little bit about just representation, the fact that leadership historically has been, of gun violence prevention groups, has been white. A lot of the leadership has actually been moderate white Republicans, if you're talking about Jim Brady, if you're talking about Michael Bloomberg. So that's sort of part of it. But what are the other strands here that would explain why a movement has not fully reckoned with the problem that it's focusing on?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it does come down to access to and not, I don't want to say just access to information, but access to allowing access from people of color into the gun violence prevention movement. And again, I don't think that this is just a challenge in the gun violence prevention community. I think that there also is a lack of kind of understanding what resources are already out there. So the report that you did last year, the work that the Law Center has done, the work that Chelsea and her colleagues have done around hate crimes, there's been a lot of really great work. A lot of it's happening in a vacuum on the state level. And so we see this happen all the time where, again, national groups get 90% of the funding, and I think that we should also, and I know all of us in this room here that work in gun violence are not necessarily want to do this, but we need to also hold our funders accountable, right? So they're the ones who are funding all of our organizations, and so there are people out there who are doing really great work. And so I'm not saying, I mean, I would like to still have a job, and so I'm not saying that to move everyone's funding away from what we're doing, because as Chelsea mentioned, it's really important that we continue to do this work and make sure that the people who have access to firearms are doing it in a safe way and keeping our communities safe. But I think that we do need to make sure that we're thinking about it from a policymaker perspective, that when we're writing these laws, I tried to find more on the state level laws around gun violence that had been either very prominent in the media around either background checks or domestic violence that were championed by, but more importantly, proposed by or by legislators that were people of color, and it's very hard to find. And on the national level, you can look at, I think Jim Clyburn has the Charleston loophole bill, and Robin Kelly in Illinois has done a lot of really great work on domestic violence laws. So there are people out here, but I also think that, and this is something that the Congresswoman Kelly, but I think other members of the CVC would say, is that we also need those members of the congressional, Democratic and Republican caucus who are white to stand up for these laws as well. And so I think that it's really important that we have allies, and I see a lot of them in the room that are not people of color, who can help us get this message out, because we are not going to be able to do it alone. We don't need non-people of color to speak for us, but we need non-people of color to speak up for us as well.
The other thing that I would add to that too is I think, efforts to enact stronger gun laws at the national level have required, in this hyper-partisan environment that we're in right now, and then in this hyper-political issue, I think that the theory has been, in order to be able to enact this legislation, you need a broad coalition that includes a couple key validators. You need law enforcement. Would be great to have gun owners, and it would be great to have Republicans. And so a lot of the movement's efforts have been focused on those key validators, and perhaps have kind of taken the base for granted, so to speak. And so I think that's where a lot of the political effort has gone in recent years, is to really, bringing law enforcement to the table, getting them to sign on and talk about how important some of these laws are. And perhaps have not focused as much on, looking at the needs and the interests of communities of color.
I think that's a really important point. Obviously, if we're looking at this historically, the gun violence prevention movement politically in D.C. has been an uphill fight the whole time. And if you looking back even to the 90s, having law enforcement come in and endorse a law saying, yes, we are police chiefs, we are sheriffs, and we support this, we think this is valuable, has been, I think, politically seen as totally crucial. So now we come to 2012 and 2013 and 2014, and there are police shootings of children. Can you talk a little bit about politically, have gun violence prevention groups begun to sort of really speak out about police shootings, and how does the value of law enforcement as sort of a shield against the NRA play into that political decision?
Yeah, I mean, I can talk a little bit about this, but we work a lot with law enforcement, but we also work with, organizations like NOBLE, which is the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement. Did I say that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think that we have we as an organization, I know, and I think other organizations have started to kind of recalculate who all we're bringing to the table, right? And so when we passed in Delaware last year and in Oregon last year, we worked with a lot of partners to help pass domestic violence laws in both Oregon and in Delaware. And for those specific pieces of legislation, it's really hard not to get them passed without bringing law enforcement to the table. But the other side of that is that you absolutely, and in all the cases where we worked, we absolutely had to make sure that the domestic violence community, including communities of color who were a part of the domestic violence community in Wilmington, where there's a very high rate of homicides with African Americans, and the same in parts of Portland, that we had that both of those voices at the table. And for us, like, we have not, especially on the state level, we have never passed a law without making sure that we've never gone into a state and just said, we are ARS and we are going to pass this law, because I don't think that it would be helpful to anybody, because we would leave the state, after the law was passed. So we've always worked with advocates on the ground to make sure that it's a piece of legislation that will be helpful to the community. But I think there has been that challenge with, and I think I would say that I don't know if there's anybody from the Brady campaign here, but the Brady campaign has existed long before any of the rest of our organizations and done a lot of really great work. But it has been a consistent kind of challenge. We work with a lot of either affiliates of or some members of Black Lives Matters for the working group, and so a lot of their first reaction to having law enforcement in the room sometimes is traumatizing. And so I think that that's also the trauma that amounts from a lot of what's been happening with police shootings, what's been happening just with gun violence in general, is something that we also don't talk about. And not to give another shout out to Gen Progress, but there are organizations like Gen Progress that put together talks about self-care, but also community care. And so I think that for a lot of us, especially African Americans, we have talked a lot about self-care and needing to take care of ourselves, but we also need to take care of our community members. And so there are lots of different ways to do that. You get a manicure, pedicure, talk about different things like that. But I think that there has to be a systemic way to really talk about what's happening in our communities, and also the trauma that is associated with everyone who raised their hand and said that they had been threatened with a gun. That's a traumatizing experience. And a lot of us that has happened to kind of put it in the back of our heads. But whenever I see a cop, I still go like this. And I'm still I see a gun, and I was never threatened by a cop or anything like that, but that is my general reaction to a gun because of what has happened to me before. And so I can only imagine for someone who has actually been a victim of a gunshot, how their reaction to such a traumatizing experience would be.
Great, thank you. There's some more themes we'll return to, but let's go to Darrell and talk a little bit about, we've been talking about the value of restricting access to guns in communities of color, what it means to do that in a more sophisticated way for advocates. But let's take a step back, think about the history and the ways in which gun control in America is or is not racist.
Okay. Thank you very much for the invitation to be out here. I'm really excited to be on this really august panel. So I think it's important to take a step back for a second, because obviously any intervention in terms of the policy criteria is going to have to do so within a certain set of legal and constitutional parameters. So I'm assuming that most of you, either casually or not, are familiar with the Heller and McDonald cases, which are the cases that essentially say the Second Amendment guarantees a personal individual right to keep and bear arms for self-defense in the home. So I don't see any realistic prospect of that being overturned, even with a different staffing of the Supreme Court, no matter how much you can get out of that in terms of political campaigns. It's just not likely to happen. I think there's too much respect for the stability of constitutional law to overturn the decision. That doesn't mean, though, that Heller and McDonald basically leave policymakers with no room to maneuver at all. In fact, most of the cases that have been litigated on Second Amendment grounds. The regulation, whether it's regulations on domestic violence misdemeanors in possession of firearms or restrictions on high-capacity magazines or so forth, most of them have been upheld. So we're really operating here is in what sort of regulatory space is there after Heller and McDonald, and the answer right now is that at least on the federal level, with respect to the federal Second Amendment as opposed to state constitutional guarantees, there's actually quite a bit of room still to do some work. On the issue about gun control, I think it's fair to say that it's a sort of favorite of gun rights advocates to point to regulations in American history that are undeniably racist. So the regulations start early. In the 17th century, before the nation is even a nation, when it's still colonist, there are regulations that say that it's criminal. You can be criminally fined for selling weapons to Indians or Native Americans after 1619 and the beginning of the importation of African slaves into the United States. Africans and enslaved persons with arms can be criminally prosecuted. They have to get special licenses and so forth. This goes on right up until the antebellum period, when there has to be a certain licensing mechanism through the master, or somebody's got to be accompanied by their owner if they are enslaved or even free with a firearm. If they're free, they had to get a special license. So there's a rich area of history here that gun rights advocates like to say, see, look, all these efforts at gun regulation all are based in racist roots. And they've got plenty to pick from, and it's undeniable. That said, what wasn't racist, right, in the history? Contract law, property law, the entire mechanisms that we sort of take for granted in terms of, fee simple or any of the technical rules about who owns an apartment, all those were racist. So the question is, all right, so, if gun control was racist, so was everything else, but we don't say that the entire architecture of our legal environment, therefore, is besmirched and has to be thrown out. We're not sort of radicals here and say that there is no law. I think that the argument about gun control that's made about it being racist proves too much. And I think it's also important to realize that the lack of gun control can also be used to racist ends, right? So if you think about it, right, the Equal Protection Clause is about equal protection. And one way, in fact, it's actually discussed during the what became the Civil Rights Act of 1866, but also the 14th Amendment. One way that you can deny people rights is by actually doing things against them. The other thing you can do is by removing your protection of them and just leaving them to, the whims and fortunes of what at one time would be thought of as the marketplace. And so I think that what we have when we think about sort of the lack of gun control as itself maybe having at least a racial dynamic, if not necessarily a racial motivation, is we have to think about the history of the lack of gun control. So an important sort of historical marker here is that the development of the professionalized police force actually coincides with Reconstruction. So at the same time that you also have freedmen who are exercising their rights as new citizens, you also have the phenomena of the creation of a professionalized police force as opposed to what occurred before, which was simply every community had its own designated set of watchmen that would police the community. There was, if somebody saw a burglary or something, they were supposed to go out and raise the hue and cry, and all the citizens with their arms would come and chase down the bad guy. And so when we talk about sort of the history of gun control or lack thereof, you have a tension. So the tension played itself out very violently in South Carolina. the scenario, the facts of what became part of the Ku Klux Klan prosecutions in the late 19th century was the following. The Southerners obviously were unhappy with having lost the Civil War. They were certainly unhappy with having all these enfranchised, or at least free blacks, not necessarily enfranchised, but free blacks around. Carl Schurz, who was doing some research for the Reconstruction Congress, comes down and says, you know what's happening? It looks as if, and he uses these terms, it looks as if blacks in the South are under a permanent state of martial law, and that martial law is essentially effected by every white citizen in the South. And so what happens in South Carolina is the militia, which becomes part of the professionalized sort of police unit in the South, is obviously very sympathetic to the Republican governments in the North, Lincoln, the party of Lincoln, and they're getting equipped. They're getting equipped with arms. Because they're the designated security apparatus. And the Klan says, why are they getting all the guns? I need to get my guns, and I'm going to start going out there and doing what we have always done before there was a designated police force. I'm going to go out there and just start, disarming people, policing the area. And in fact, when they are eventually prosecuted, the Klan says, what's the deal? This is what we've always done. We've always been the police. We didn't organize ourselves as the Klan, but we're just doing something very traditional. And so, I think it's important that, every time the National Rifle Association or a gun rights organization says, hey, look at what Everytown or whatever are doing, they're just tapping into the racist roots of gun control. I think it's also important to think, but the idea of a totally democratized security apparatus where everybody has guns and polices everyone else, that also has a very racist roots as well. And so I think it's important to sort of think about that, especially in what I and some of my colleagues that sort of write in this area detect as a kind of, let's just democratize violence. My co-author Joseph Blocher and I have a sort of terminology, so a marketplace of violence, and it's I think best expressed by Wayne LaPierre's statement that the only thing that stops a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun, right? The fact that the invisible hand of the market will create an idealized set of security for everybody. That's an empirical proposition. I'm not sure that's true. But even if it was, we all know that sort of these market-based solutions tend to have sort of disproportionate impacts of various kinds. And let me give you a sort of crisp example from the social science area. Is anybody here familiar with the shooter bias? Heard about the shooter bias? All right, so the shooter bias is a social science experiment in which some individuals are charged with firing a gun at a video screen. The video screen has a person, white or black, and they pull various things, right, from under the coats or in their pockets. Sometimes it's a weapon, a gun, a knife. Sometimes it's something innocuous, a wallet, a cell phone. The social science shows that systematically African American men are more likely to be shot, even when they pull something that would otherwise be innocuous. The disparity drops a little as between just ordinary citizens and the police, but the disparity still exists. That is, if you think about the number of false positives, you have less false positives overall, but as compared to pulling the weapon to fire at a white male, there tends to be a disparity. So the issue here is that, if in fact the sort of idealized state of gun rights organizations is that the invisible hand of the marketplace of violence is going to end up in a, better safety for all. I don't know if that's not going to be on the backs of African Americans in particular, and that the disparate impact that these kinds of radical sort of democratization of violence is not going to actually end up making communities of color worse off in the end. So I think one issue that we have to sort of think about, in terms of both the history, but in sort of modern questions about sort of gun control and gun violence, especially in community colors, is we're working within a constitutional framework. I don't think Heller or McDonald's going anywhere. That said, you don't necessarily have to buy the idea that just because you think that maybe the invisible hand of the market won't actually work out the way you think it will, that somehow you are doing it for some sort of nefarious purpose. I think that it's important to think about where in this regulatory space, which there still is plenty of room to work, you can make sure that some of the rough edges of the Heller and McDonald cases can be sort of sanded down.
Great, thank you so much. So let's actually start off there in that last point. One thing that is very interested in looking at the aftermath of Heller and McDonald, I think some have framed it as these were supposed to be a revolution in gun rights in America. But if you look at what lower courts have, how lower courts have interpreted the law, in fact, basically every gun law has survived except for outright handgun bans. So I'm interested, can you speak a little bit more about sort of what might explain that phenomenon where we have sort of what was a quite aggressive and controversial ruling in Heller and McDonald, but then we have federal courts in their interpretation of the laws, and especially in their willingness to apply strict scrutiny in various cases, sort of pulling back in ways that certainly Justices Scalia and Thomas found extremely frustrating.
Right. So, one is a sort of esoteric question about how do you go about answering that question. So Heller and McDonald are the apogee of a certain type of theory about how you interpret the Constitution, and called originalism. So, for sort of nerds like me, sort of, your father's originalism was what would James Madison have wanted us to do. Modern originalism is a little more nuanced and says, well, what do these words mean? What would these words mean to a speaker of English? But that doesn't get you very far, right? Because a speaker of English, I say, keep bear arms, and I'm talking about, a Kalashnikov on Pennsylvania Avenue. Well, yeah, I know that meets all those terminologies, but it can't be that that's permitted. And so what happens in the lower courts, and even in the Heller and McDonald opinion themselves, if you get this dial back, you have, say, you have this sort of bold pronouncement that, well, the Second Amendment means what it says. It means you have a right to carry a weapon, right? For self-defense, but not in sensitive places, and not, but only for legal purposes, and not if you're a felon, and all these kinds of things. In fact, as I think Judge Wilkinson said, sort of in order to not have to deal with the more unpleasant consequences of the statement that has just been made. So, what's happening, I think, in terms of the legal architecture, is the reason why lower courts have done this is they recognize that you really can't have an absolutist position, at least in Heller and McDonald, and not even 5 members of the court seem to think that an absolutist position would take place. What's important, I think, about the opinions is they crystallize a certain type of entitlement, right? They crystallize a kind of entitlement mindset. Before Heller and McDonald, you could say, I have a right, but you were really talking in the language of politics. Now you're talking in the language of law. And so, that means that, when you try to take people's things away, whether they're using them or not, it tends to create a kind of stickiness, right? People don't like. From Ohio. I used to live in Ohio, and every time they tried to sort of change the way judges were selected to an appointment process rather than an election process, it always lost. Not that anybody really thought it was a good idea, but they just didn't want stuff taken away, right? And so one thing is it sort of crystallized that people now can talk in the language of rights, which has a kind of very powerful allure in our sort of political discourse. The second thing is that it also galvanizes these sort of interventions at the state level, which I think is the place where it can become really, really difficult. So we know, for example, in the federal system, we tend to have these reasonable regulations upheld by federal courts, usually using a kind of what's known as a sort of lightened scrutiny called intermediate scrutiny. So as long as there is a reasonable fit between the regulation and a substantial government interest, or an important government interest, the regulation gets upheld. But many states, right, have ratcheted it up in their own state constitutions, the legal architecture for determining this, to something like strict scrutiny, which in its traditional formulation meant that the regulation always lost. So the real, I think the real sort of mischief, if we want to think about it in terms of gun rights, gun control advocacy at the state level, is what to do about the sort of entrenched strict scrutiny regimes that have been implemented in terms of the state constitutions. And when we talk about strict scrutiny, it applies across the board. It means, felons. It means people taking guns into schools and churches and all that kind of stuff. And so, I think that's one of the sort of things that sort of the communities will really have to think about in terms of these sort of state constitutional law. And if I could just add one more thing. The other thing to be aware of is, especially on the state level, is my colleague Joseph Blocher wrote a law review article on firearm localism. And so what's happening in sort of these in these states when they amend their constitutions is the kind of gun culture of the country is being applied to the city. So, it might be one thing to carry, a rifle when you're going out, deer hunting or elk hunting out in the country. It's quite another thing to think that, in downtown Atlanta, that the gun culture would be exactly the same. But what these sort of rules do is they sort of flatten that out. One, I think, aspect of the gun rights advocates want to do is sort of have that happen on a nationwide basis, that the laws of Montana and the norms with regard to guns in Montana need to apply in Chicago and the South Side in particular.
Darrell, I'm going to return to something that you said earlier, which was the question of, is the lack of gun control racist as much as perhaps gun control could be seen as racist? And I want to sort of push on that a little bit more. Obviously, we're here focused today on guns and gun violence, but as Chelsea and Amber pointed out, this is happening as part of a larger conversation about the safety of communities of color in a lot of different ways, and sort of organizationally, but also substantively, it's been very difficult to have these very siloed conversations. So we have a conversation on guns, and we have a conversation on police reform. We have a conversation on police violence. As if these things were quite separate, when in fact they are intimately connected. And from the perspective of community members, from the perspective of a mother I interviewed last year in Indianapolis, whose husband was shot by a young black man at a gas station and killed, and left her with 7 sons, all of them black. And she was terrified from all directions. She was terrified of the police shooting one of her sons. She was terrified of another young man in Indianapolis shooting one of her sons, that she was constantly worried about them in a way that wasn't siloed from one thing or the other, in a way that she wanted her sons to be safe. She wanted the police to be better. She had, in fact, very good experiences in that her husband's murder was solved, and that the the young men who killed him went to prison, something that many victims do not get. And yet, because the police in Indianapolis would pull her over to the side of the road when she was driving with her kids in a minivan over and over again, she didn't have a good impression of the police, even though by sort of objective measures, she was one of the lucky ones. So I'm curious, there's a lot of ways to jump into this, but starting with you, Darrell, talk about a little bit, especially Jill Leovy and Ghetto Side has really emphasized this under-policed, overprotected idea for communities of color. And I'm interested, has there been any attempt, could there be any attempt to use equal protection to look at things like homicide clearance rates, to look at the safety in communities of color, and use that as an avenue to deal with this problem?
So, it's a really important question. I think there is there's some statistical evidence, for example, that the lower the confidence rate you have in the actual police, the higher the murder rates go, right? So there's an inverse relationship. And so, part of the problem is if you have no confidence that the police will actually behave fairly or even show up, then, as they say, the thing gets resolved in the street. Right, and so you end up with everybody sort of taking their own private vengeances into their own hands, to sort of go back to Locke's formulation. The problem is multifaceted. If you had more confidence that the police would actually be fair, administer justice fairly, not harass the citizenry, then there might be lower murder rates, in part because people have more confidence that when they call the police that something is going to be done, it's going to be done fairly. I think the other aspect of this is where do you get the most leverage if you're thinking about policy? The problem with the democratization of violence, or the marketplace of violence, is if there is problems with the police force, the communities of color can band together. They can actually exact some kind of punishment in terms of the mayor, the police chief, whoever. If what is happening instead is it's a sort of an army of George Zimmermans who all go out there sort of empowered to enforce the law whenever they think it's being violated, only subject to some after the fact prosecution maybe, then, as far as a matter of policy levers, there are none. I don't get a vote on what George Zimmerman or whoever is policing the part of the neighborhood watch. I don't get a vote on that. And so, if you're looking for like points at which you can, actually affect change in a way that's not going to that will resolve these sort of disparate impacts, I can see more effect. In the sense of being able to reform the police as a matter of political leverage by demonstration, as opposed to this sort of radically democratized version of that I think some not all, but some gun rights advocates want to promote.
Interesting. And just curious, it seems that equal protection is not being used as a way to challenge police forces. Why is that?
Yeah, well, part of the problem is, as a legal doctrinal matter, is the equal protection clause doesn't go to disparate impacts, right? So the fact that you make some kind of determination and it has a disproportionate impact on a certain group is not in and of itself a violation of equal protection. That's Washington versus Davis. That's Feeney. That's these cases from 50 years ago. Well, maybe not 50, but at least from the middle of the 20th century. And so there's not a federal equal protection argument unless you're trying to smoke out some sort of disparate treatment. That is the reason why the police aren't going to police these areas is because the mayor or the city council, doesn't care about them. But that's hard to suss out, and so that just exposes the sort of limited reach of what a litigation strategy can be, as opposed to, using the equal protection idea to motivate people, right, as an organizational principle for social action, as opposed to litigation.
Gotcha. Really interesting. Okay, we're going to open it up to questions from the audience. I also have a few lingering questions that I might throw in there. Who would like to start us off? Right back there.
I'm not a lawyer, so that's probably obvious with this question. Why does the Declaration of Independence right to life not trump the 14th Amendment right to bear arms?
Because the Declaration of Independence isn't law. It's a moral document. It's a moral statement, but you can't say, hey, you're denying me something that is guaranteed to me by the Declaration of Independence because, this gets into some of the esoterics, but, the Declaration of Independence is a political document. It's not a legal document. The Constitution is a legal document. Now, the Declaration of Independence informs equal protection. You have a right to that no state can deprive you of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, and no state can deny you equal protection of the law. But that gets back to the construction that we just talked about disparate impacts. Due process is a tautology. You're only afforded the process that is due, and that kind of depends on what the scenario is, and so that's the problem. Is the Declaration of Independence is not really law. It's a sort of moral document that tends to infuse the way we think about the law. But I'm actually writing a piece on this right now. There's tons and tons of what are known as pro se litigants. They don't have lawyers. They all say, you violated my rights under the Declaration of Independence. They all lose.
Everyone wait for the microphone so we can capture it on the recording.
Hi, I'm Peter Nye. I'm interested in this issue from a sort of a moral philosophy perspective that informs the legal perspective, and I'm thinking it is interesting that both sides of the issue seem to be using the language of rights as opposed to the language of utilitarianism, usually to talk about this issue, and it seems to me that if you're going to use the language of rights, then you must acknowledge that a right is by definition a trump on utility, and in the case of gun rights, the right to bear arms is by definition the right to bear arms even if it creates a negative net utility, which it seems like Wayne LaPierre is what he's essentially saying when he says freedom isn't free. So I just want to hear, why do you think it is that both sides seem to be talking about a rights-based framework as opposed to a utilitarian framework, and why do most people who use a rights-based framework refuse to admit and fail to argue with the dictum that a right is by definition a trump on utility? So how do you think that informs the issue from a legal perspective?
Well, one is definitional, right? So, at least in the legal context, rights are trumps, but rights are also defined at certain levels of abstraction. You have a right to free speech, but if I say hand over your money, right, or I'm going to club you on the head, right? It's a right to free speech except for that. And so the utilitarian idea gets smuggled in terms of the definitional work that the right is made, which goes back to what Lois and I were talking about before, which is, Heller and MacDonald sort of start out with these broad pronouncements about rights, and then these things about, well, do we really mean that? I'm not sure I wanted a trump in every single circumstance, and so you get what are known as the sort of carve-outs, that's one reason. The other reason is that utilitarian considerations, although they do get deployed in legal arguments are typically policy arguments. They're arguments that we usually leave to other organs of government rather than the judiciary. People get together and say, what's the cost benefit here? This is going to help these many people, it's not going to help these many people. Let's see what the Pareto optimal in the economic sense, right, function would be, and let's sort it out. We don't have a culture that deals with constitutional rights at that level, and so that's why we don't talk about utility in expressways. We talk about it in this sort of we smuggle it in terms of defining the level of abstraction of the right.
And I'll add to that, and it kind of speaks to the prior question too, which is, I think what we see a lot in the debate, right, is that you have gun rights advocates really digging in on this rights framework. This is my Second Amendment right. It's a constitutional right. It is this is my God, granted by God, and all of this stuff, right? And then what you see a lot of, and I think we're still working on crafting this argument a little bit more, but on the side of kind of advocating for gun violence prevention and policies is more of a morals-based argument and a, is this the kind of country we want to live in, right? And that's where you see these comparisons to, U.S. gun death numbers with, to make the international comparison. And holding up the stories of, victims of gun violence and putting faces and names to gun violence, like the family that you're talking about. That's really building a more morals-based argument for stronger gun laws or for action on this issue. To try, I think, to balance a little bit this very kind of strict, my constitutional rights-based argument you see on the other side, and the two. I don't think they need to be mutually exclusive arguments, but that's kind of what you see the debate shaping out to be. And so in many senses, we're kind of talking past each other. We're kind of almost talking about different things when in fact we're trying to talk about the same issue.
I think that's a really important question to grapple with, is what is the gun debate actually about? And I think you're framing it like it's not rights on both sides. It is sort of a what is our community on one side, and then on the other side a question of what freedom is. And one of, I think, the challenges in weighing it or in taking utilitarian perspective on this is that on the one hand you have gun violence prevention advocates really talking about the numbers of the people dying and the numbers of the people injured. If you talk to many people on the gun rights side, you're going to hear about the risk of the end of democracy, the risk of totalitarianism. Ray Diamond, who couldn't unfortunately be with us today, when we were talking previously, said, especially with the rise of someone like Donald Trump, he was interested if more minorities might be in favor of the idea of civilian gun ownership, of self-protection, if, at this moment, fascism seems like more of a threat to more people than it might have a year ago. But it's very difficult to actually weigh the concrete number of people who are actually injured and actually dying with the threat of what our country could become without these guns. Those are two very different questions, and weighing sort of theoretical lives against actual lives is quite challenging.
Can I also want to intervene. Yeah. So, we've got rights that are sort of encoded in the Constitution. We have sort of moral claims. Part of this dynamic is self-determination, right? You have lots of communities that you have, a majority of, majority minorities, right? That actually control the state or the municipal governments, and so. There's a sort of self-determination, and why is it that if black communities that are led by black leaders think that I think the best thing for us would be to actually have less guns. Why is it that their voices aren't heard? So there's the self-determination aspect. There's also other kinds of values that we have that aren't sort of abstract in that sense, but also constitutional values. We have rights to free speech. And we have areas that we think that an important, robust interchange of ideas will be negatively affected if we think that people have guns there. think the university. You know, there's a reason why, for example, Texas and other states during Reconstruction, but afterwards said, you know what, maybe people shouldn't be taking their guns to the polling places. That might be a site of conflict, or to a political rally. You know, to the extent that you've got other sort of rights or values that we think are equally important, it's not just a binary between, you know, what actually makes people safer or less safe. We might say, you know what, I'll be a little less safe, but I'd rather be able to talk and have a free interchange of ideas in a Republican democracy.
Yeah, interesting to think about the sort of cultural stakes on both sides of the gun debate and how those line up and don't line up with the actual data. Things like guns on campus, or always the emphasis on children, children getting shot, or accidental child shootings. These are things that resonate very deeply with people. School shootings resonate very deeply with people because of this cultural idea of safety, or what it means, what kind of community we have. If you're talking about who are the victims of gun violence, those are not the victims of gun violence. Those are very statistically rare events, but have huge political capital. Who's next?
Hi, I'm Emma with the National Domestic Violence Hotline, and this has just been a fantastic panel. I was really interested earlier, you were talking about, you know, work group that had been formed and recommendations, and I'm thinking especially as a national agency that works with, you know, smaller organizations, state and local, and they have these good intentions. They want to be more diversified, they want to have more voices at the table, but good intentions are not best practice, and there's a lot of flubbing that goes on in figuring that out. So I'm wondering what you think are like tools that are out there for them, or good first steps, or ways for people on the ground wanting to do advocacy in a more inclusive way. How do they get started?
Yeah, I can kind of talk about that. I think that, well, first of all, thank you for all the work that you guys do. You guys have been a great partner of ours, and we appreciate everything you guys do. I think that there's a way that, especially national groups, I think that out of the people who kind of sit around the gun table that we talk every week, or we meet in person every month, I think a lot of this is incumbent upon us to be able to continue to tell the stories. I know that you guys did a big, I think it was a study last year on domestic violence, and you did a big story and had all these stories of different people, not just women, but people in different communities, of the stories of domestic violence. And so one of the things that I think was helpful for us was to be able to uplift those stories, but I think that that's something that other organizations can also be doing in a more intentional way. And so not just talking about it, we don't need to just be talking about domestic violence in October when it's Domestic Violence Awareness Month. We need to be talking about it every day because it's impacting our communities. And so I think, you know, from a gun violence prevention table perspective, one thing that we could use help with is making sure that what is actually happening on the ground gets connected to us on a national level. One of the things that was happened after the working group was founded was that there's a state policy kind of group that has been meeting for the last 3 years, and then there's a federal policy group that has been meeting for the last 3 years. And during legislative sessions, they usually have a weekly call. And for the last 3 years, they've consisted of only white people. No people of color have been a part of those calls, and not by any other intention of just those were the people who were in the room. And so after Charleston last year, there was a intentional effort to make sure that people were included, and they weren't just like, oh, Amber, this is what used to happen in the past, Amber, can you be on this call? And I'm like, no, I cannot be the only person of color that you know, but there are tons of other organizations that actually represent people of color in states. And so we work with Amnesty International, who does work on international. Lori and Ladder here from the Coalition to End Gun Violence. There's a lot of work that they've been doing with pastors and work in Virginia. And so we're trying to do a better job on a national level with the tables to making sure that that information is, the best practices are getting highlighted. And I don't think that that has happened, but that's something that we can be held accountable for. And part of what is coming out of the assessment that we did at our next meeting that we'll have, our next call, will be to set those benchmarks of how we're going to hold ourselves accountable, and then really have a longer conversation about it, where we've come in the last year whenever we have our state kind of advocates convening in August. And one of the things that came out of the meeting that we had, the national summit that we had last year, is there was probably out of the 130, I'm just spitballing here, but I think probably 130 people that were there was probably maybe 4 or 5 people that were people of color. And so one of our charges to ourselves is to make sure that that room doesn't look the same next year. And so that doesn't mean that all the great people who are there can't come again, but we need to make it so there are maybe 300 people in the room, and there are people who represent communities of color that are a part of that conversation.
I serve on the board of the Brady campaign to prevent gun violence, and I'm really intrigued with this conversation because I have the same frustration that Amber expressed in dealing with Brady. That is, the extent to which the organization was established and developed legislation that we call the Brady Bill. But yet we're not really dealing with the fears that both blacks and whites have about each other when we get down into the gun violence concerns. And I'm speaking particularly with Charleston. My church is not a few blocks from here, and last summer when Charleston happened, I talked to the head of our deacon board, and he said to me, ain't nothing like this gonna happen here. I mean, his reaction was, we in our black church have got to protect ourselves from white people who are likely to come in. Yet the numbers are black men shooting each other, and that scares the hell out of everybody. But we really don't talk about the extent to which white men shoot themselves. The largest cohort of shootings, of suicides, is older white men. But our fear, our concern seems to be the fact that we pick up the paper almost every day and some black person has shot another black person. So the need to talk about race and guns is extraordinary, but we don't need to do, we don't do it enough. And so I want to give thanks to whoever put this together, but also to figure out a way that we can encourage more discussions like this. And finally, I'm concerned that we on the gun advocate, the gun violence advocacy end, we're not as public and determined in pushing our point of view as the gun rights folks are. Somebody mentioned that gun rights folks insist that they've got to protect themselves from having their guns taken away. But that seems to me to have nothing to do with the fact that there are 33,000 people who are killed by guns each year. Are we prepared to accept 33,000 gun deaths as collateral damage to prevent our guns from being taken away?
I think a lot of people are.
Yeah.
That's terribly sad.
Yeah. And I'll just say thank you for your work with the Brady campaign. I think that another thing that we haven't really talked about is media and rapid response to mass shootings versus the shootings that happen every day. And I think everyone always brings up Chicago, but it's happening in our backyard. I live in Northeast DC. And so I think that as gun violence prevention advocates, we have to do a better job. We all belong to a listserv, and like we kind of see every time there is a mass shooting that happens, but we don't see the everyday shootings, the mass shootings that are happening across the country. And so I don't mean to say that I think that the media is going to stop covering a story if we're telling them every single day there's a mass shooting, but maybe they're not. And I think that we also have to hold, the same way that we're holding policymakers and ourselves accountable, we have to hold the media accountable for not actually telling our stories. And so there have been some, mostly African-American journalists who have talked about this, and so we're very happy about the ProPublica article last year just to kind of make sure that people were actually having these conversations. And as uncomfortable as it is, because we're not getting it right, and we haven't gotten it right, and it's really hard to say that because we're all adults and we don't want to be told that maybe we should change what we're doing. But I think that it's really important, especially with the way that social media works and rapid response across the board. And you're right, we're about more than 100 years behind on the kind of from the gun rights side. So I know when I go into state legislative offices, and in Delaware in particular, I sat across from the NRA and negotiated, and you should have seen their faces when I walked in as the negotiator from the gun safety groups. They were like, where are the other people that are going to come here? And I said, I'm it. Like, you got to deal with me. And so I think that there's a lot of really, we're smaller in numbers and funding than the gun I guess kind of rights groups, but I think that we're right, and that I think that we also need to, whenever we're talking to elected officials, and not just the ones that are in the districts that are blue or purple, but ones across the country, need them to hold them accountable and their feet to the fire about how they're voting on these issues as well, because they haven't been before. So,
like this gentleman, I cringe when I open up the Post and find that 3 or 4 black men murder 3 or 4 black men in certain areas of the city. And I think the reason for this, these men are mostly uneducated, unemployed, and many of them are on drugs. And to them, having a gun may be the only, and society pretty much doesn't think very much of these men. And I think that the black men that are killing other black men, having the gun is the only source of power that they may feel. And I think that the only way you're going to reduce this is to find an alternative that makes these people feel that there are other ways to feel empowered other than carrying a gun. And that's going to be a very difficult thing, but as we say, the vast majority of murders are black men killing other black men. So is there some organization working towards dealing with the issue from developing another source of empowerment for these poor, uneducated black men?
So I think that I would love for Amber to talk about that, because there are so many, and this will be our last comment, just talking a little bit about the solutions.
Yeah, absolutely, and thank you for raising this. I think we first have to, though they're maybe uneducated, have to humanize the people that this is happening to, whether it's intra-racial violence or not. That it is there's still a certain humanity to those people that this is happening to, whether or not they're of the same race or not. But one of the reports, and I don't have other copies of it, but I'm just going to hold it up. And Garrett, am I going to get the smartguns.org? Yes, smartgunlaws.org. So there's been a lot of really great reports that have come out, but one that came out very recently is Healing Communities in Crisis, which is the Law Center to Prevent Gun Violence, and the PICO Network. And the PICO Network is a faith-based community organizing national organization, but they do really great work in communities and have been one of the biggest proponents of the ceasefire kind of method of working in communities of color, but also it's not just specific to communities of colors, but it's specific to working with communities in crisis. And a couple of the key things that came out of this report is really talking about how you can go into communities and be respectful, and talks a lot about language. And this is something that we talk about as a gun violence prevention community. I have been arrested before. I don't want to be called a criminal, but sometimes when you call someone a criminal versus someone who is formerly incarcerated, it makes a big difference. Or sometimes if you call someone an individual versus like a thug or predator, there's just different words that people use that can feel more inclusive. And so specifically for ceasefire, which was started, I believe, in Boston in the 90s, and in some cases has seen a success rate of lowering crime by 50 to 60%, and by gun crime by 50 to 60% in communities. It really is the basis of it is to get small smaller groups, sometimes people as little as 30 people, 20 to 30 people together from communities to decide from a community perspective on what they are going to tolerate. And so sometimes that means having law enforcement there at the table. It also means having members of the faith community there to talk about what the challenges are in those communities. And so at the end of a lot of these different sessions, and I can't remember the exact terminology that, the call-ins, they talk about at the request of the community, this is what we are going to do next. And so I think that that's really important, and especially as a lot of us work with national groups kind of coming in and saying, here's the really great policy that we're thinking about, can you institute this in your city or in your municipality? But this is really a process that has been proven to work with community leaders, but also just communities in general, to hold the community accountable for what is going to happen, instead of necessarily having somebody come in from the outside, whether it be law enforcement or an elected official, and say, hey, there's been a lot of crime in this community, this needs to stop, and this is how you're going to stop it, but using the community as the way to kind of do the process. And so they call it group violence intervention. And so it's been proven effective across the country, and I think that it's something that we definitely want to highlight. Other groups around the table want to make sure that we are doing a lot more. And then the last thing that I'll say is that Chelsea and I were a part of a group of people with the Joyce Foundation, the Joint Center, and the Urban Institute, who did a 3-city series of kind of field studies on urban gun violence last year. And so we went to Richmond, Virginia, we went to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and we went to Stockton, California. And one of the first things that we talked about with people in the room, and the people who were in the room for the most part were members of the faith community, members of law enforcement. At every single one, we had people that were either the police chief for that city and also people who would consider themselves, kind of more beat cops, to kind of talk about what it was like from that perspective, besides just being kind of like the leadership of the police force. And we, out of those discussions, we, learned a lot about what gun violence actually means in a lot of these communities, and how it's different depending on whether or not you're a major pastor in a community versus like an elected official. And then I think one of the most important things that we learned is really about the community response to gun violence. And so how does law enforcement actually respond in Richmond, Virginia, whenever there is a mass shooting or there is there's a shooting on a block, and what is that response helpful? How do people think that's helpful? And so the same thing across the board whenever we went to Milwaukee and whenever we went to when we went to Stockton. In Milwaukee, the police chief there and the mayor do not see eye to eye on pretty much anything, but definitely nothing on gun violence prevention. And so it was definitely interesting for us to have them both in the room to talk about solutions on gun violence prevention. And a lot of it came down to what resources are available, especially to the local community groups. There's lots of funding that's out there, either from states or federal governments, and a lot of it isn't getting allocated to these groups to be able to do a lot, especially like ceasefire programs. It's just not happening. And so I think this is another thing we can hold elected officials on the federal and state level accountable for, is making sure that that funding is getting into the right hands. And then we also learned a lot about, again, like who's at the table. And so at the last convening that we did in Stockton was the one where we had the most people who were formerly incarcerated. And so it was very just eye-opening to see people who are active members of their community, but also just learned how to use a cell phone last year because they were incarcerated for 30 years. And we come in and say, hey guys, there's this, background checks policy, and we really want you guys to support it. And they're like, trying to integrate themselves back into communities. So I think that there's a lot of community programs, again, that have existed for a very long time, like Ceasefire. There's hospital intervention programs that also the Healing Communities in Crisis report talks about, that I think is something else that really gets to the heart of what a lot of us talk about, but hasn't necessarily risen to the national media forefront, is talking about gun violence as a public health crisis. And so there's a lot of different programmings that are out there to directly work with hospitals and hospital administrators and doctors to make sure that that's a pinnacle point of what they're doing.
And if I can just jump in, because I think that's what you said, Amber, at the end is important, because the inclusiveness is important, but if the issue of gun violence gets to be seen as that's a black person's problem, then that will be the death knell of any actual policy solution. It is about creating coalitions of people that are concerned about violence in the black community and in inner cities and communities of color, but also persons that are interested in preventing suicide rates by older white males, people that are interested in reasonable gun restrictions because they're suburban moms or live in the suburbs or whatever. So there's an upside, but there's also a serious downside if this becomes, another problem for that community, and I can live in my gated community and never have to worry about it.
And I think you've just brought us sort of back to the initial question, which is, one of the reasons that why we haven't talked about racial disparities in gun violence, I think, is precisely that fear that if you are honest about who the victims are, that might actually undermine the push for reform. Thank you all so much for this conversation. Thank you all for being here. We've had so much to think about, and I hope we have some time to chat afterwards. I'll certainly be sticking around.